Should get a notification. We're going live. The hamster wheel's turning. Let's go, Roger. We're all organic over here. All of our technology is Luddite-ish. Okay. Fantastic, guys. Give us a thumbs up. Hey, Don Lester's in the chat. Good to see you in there.
Oh, hi, Don.
Always good to see Don here. Okay, I'm going to hit record and fire this up. Hey, Andy, thanks again for joining us today. Always one of our favorites.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be with you guys.
Okay. Andy K and the Funky Bunch. That's our band name. Here we
We
go.
always have a good chat going. A lot of good people there.
Yeah. It's always fun going live too, you know.
I see
You never
John
know.
McAfee's with us today there.
John McAfee.
The spirit of.
Oh,
Oh,
he's
he's still alive.
He's alive and well. Okay, here we go. And boom, we're back for another episode of Alfacast. I'm Mike Winner, and I'm here as always with the illustrious Dr. Bear Paul Lando, coming to you live and direct from the great state of Jefferson, where freedom still reigns supreme, up here on the beautiful azure waters of the Smith River. The gardens be just flourishing. The weather is just teasing us into summer. We've had some nice cool days. Absolutely perfect working weather, Bear. But it looks like we've got rain coming in this weekend, which our gardens will like as well.
Yeah, we welcome it because 90-degree days trying to keep everything hydrated gets kind of old. But, all's good. We're looking forward to a fun weekend here. We're actually feeling very festive here. Deb and I are going to celebrate Juneteenth by going to the Big Flat Pride parade today. And, I just love the holiday season.
Yeah, there's a big contingent of trans in Big Flat. I know that.
Yeah, there's Deb, myself, a small herd of cattle up the street there, and some sheep, and maybe 3 other people.
When someone's saying the word tranny in Big Flat, they're literally talking about a transmission. Well, hey, it's so good to be here. Very excited for this chat. It's always a treat when good Alfacast friend Dr. Andrew Kaufman stops in for a visit. Andy and the Alfacast crew here, we first crossed paths just prior to the medical false flag of 2020 as we shared a common perspective, albeit unorthodox by accepted standards, that medicine should be more engaged in treating the bioterrain rather than making war on alleged pathogens within the context of disease. Those tumultuous times left their scars on the more vulnerable amongst us, but many escaped unscathed with eyes wide open. Many now question not only medicine, but the legal, governmental, and financial systems in their conventional forms. Andrew brings a deep understanding of the mechanisms shared by these seemingly diverse institutions, as well as the larger nexus behind their creation. Dr. Andrew Kaufman is a self-proclaimed recovering physician who boldly transitioned from a prestigious career in mainstream medicine to become a prominent voice challenging conventional medical paradigms. Initially trained in the allopathic approach, Dr. Andy embarked on a transformative journey that led him to question conventional medical principles. Fueled by an insatiable curiosity for deeper truths, he has since become a dynamic educator and speaker, sharing his insights into medicine, the nature of viruses, and the power of natural healing. Additionally, he delves into the interconnected realms of economics, law, education, and science, offering a holistic perspective that challenges the status quo and inspires others to think critically about the world around them. With a Bachelor of Science in Biology from MIT, an MD from the University of South Carolina, and a psychiatric residency at Duke University, Dr. Andy has held academic leadership roles, contributed to research, and patented a medical device. Now he dedicates himself to researching and delivering trustworthy products and protocols, empowering health seekers to achieve optimal wellness. Follow Dr. Andy on Medicatum Authentica. He's also started a podcast. It's on, you can find that on all the major channels there, YouTube, Instagram, Rumble, to gain knowledge and take charge of your health journey. Expect a lively roundtable discussion today that could take us into a diversity of topics that will surely inspire and inform in this not-to-be-missed episode. Dr. Bear Lando, please take it away, my friend.
Mr. Andrew, thank you so much for being with us today. You're looking Quite well. I think life is agreeing with you there. So I haven't talked to you in a little bit, but really good to see you, my friend. And thanks again for being with us.
It's the same here, Bear. I'm trying to maximize my health and longevity, and am following certain lifestyle pathways to achieve that. So thanks for noticing. But yeah, it's being in this kind of realm of knowledge gives you a lot more opportunities to live in a different way.
Yeah, it opens a lot of doors, doesn't it? Early on in my experience, I delved into all sorts of subject matter, ranging from not just medicine, when I was out there practicing, but also the legal system, the financial system. And a lot of people would question me, like, oh, why is a practitioner type, interested in those things? I became quite convinced along the way that health is a resonance. And first of all, that resonance has to carry with it a freedom. I don't know what other word to put on it. A sense of freedom, and that's why we termed this episode the freedom terrain. And just as a lot of us have discovered that we are not victims of disease or victims of little microbes, which really externalizes power, our own power, our self-determination to an external authority, so forth. But when we delve into those other institutions, financial, legal, then we find that we're doing the same thing. We're giving our authority away to somebody else, and that really, creates that same resonance, I believe, throughout our body, through every cell of our body, that the belief that microbes are out to get us and lurking in every alleyway to wait and pounce on us. So, there's really a commonality when you look at these institutions, and I know you understand this. So I was hoping maybe today, first, I'd like to just hear, catch up, more, hear about what you're up to, where you're living and so forth. But then maybe, delve into how all these diverse topics are really one and the same, and how they have everything to do with our health. So welcome once again. And yeah, start off, tell us what you've been up to. And I know you've been up to a lot of good things.
Well, of course, I'm always keeping myself busy, always, that curiosity that Mike alluded to is always there. So I'm always trying to learn about new things. And, you make a really, really important and excellent point, because, and I want to approach this from a couple of different ways, because, from one thing, we have really a cultural shift, and specifically about, how children are raised, what their views are about what they will become as adults, the, of course, indoctrination system of compulsory schooling that we have. And there's been a shift for, to create people, the ones who perhaps have the highest intellect or serve in the highest level of professions, in our society, that they are extremely narrow and parochial in their knowledge and applications in their profession. And, even, for example, within the discipline of biology and academic biology, right, which is where this kind of thing manifests out, you have people who are in a variety of sub-disciplines just within biology, right? So you have like the people who are entomologists, you have ecologists, and then you have molecular biologists, cell biologists, you have virologists, immunologists, and these are all really separate little niches, and they don't really communicate well across these sub-disciplines. And in fact, they often have their own language, where I remember learning this, as an undergrad when I was in a research lab, where people were saying, yeah, don't try to read a virology paper because you won't understand it, right? Even though you would understand, a molecular biology manuscript. And because of this parochialization or compartmentalization of knowledge, skill, experience, you lose sight of what's really going on, and you don't understand the bigger picture of that institution, and you don't understand its relationship to the other major institutions in our society. And obviously that's at great detriment for the advancement of knowledge, but also for the individual. If you're stuck in one area of thinking, right, how are you going to handle the other problems in your life? Like, I mean, even just in practically speaking, like as a doctor, you get this education teaching you, you know, something about medicine, not really the important things, but they don't teach you anything about running a medical practice as a business. So you get out there, you have your MD, you get your license, and then what do? You have no idea how to set up your shop, right? You're saddled with all this debt, so it puts a lot of personal constraints upon you, which is not good. Now, if we look back at what people were like, you know, in the pre-Horace Mann compulsory education era in this country, we had higher literacy rates. We had much more polymaths, you know, people who had multiple areas of knowledge and skills, you know, more of the sort of Renaissance man type of ideal was there. And that led to, you know, self-sufficiency, major advancement, economic success like we had, you know, in the middle of the 19th century, for example. And now, you know, we've really lost that. So I'm trying to, you know, be part of the movement that reverses that and that encourages you to, you know, become your own decision maker, to become, you know, at least competent in all the areas, all the aspects that we need to be in life to get by, right? And so that includes, of course, health relates to all these other areas, because if your health is compromised, you're not going to be able to participate fully in the other aspects of what you're doing. And I kind of look at it, you know, as like health and spiritual development are like the first steps. And the spiritual development is more of the psychological aspects of how you're approaching, you know, life. And the health is, you know, obviously to make sure that you have the vitality and the, you know, freedom from frank disease to actually go out there and do stuff and accomplish what you want to do. So it's intimately related. And you know, you make a further good point that the same fallacies and you know, logical errors and false paradigms and propagandistic influences are present in all of these different institutions that take away your agency, allow, you know, an authority figure really to impose their agenda on you, make you think it's for your benefit in some way, or use things like convenience to get you to participate, but not, you know, trusting you to have the wherewithal to think for yourself and make your own decision about it. And that's going to lead to the ultimate demise, like it already has really compromised people, and people are not, you know, living in the same way and to the same level of satisfaction that they perhaps were. And I don't mean that life should be easy and rosy. You know, to live a good life, it's got to be challenging. There's got to be adversity for you to overcome. It's not going to be necessarily an easy way to live, but it's a way that you will feel proud of, that you will achieve, that you will meet your goals of providing for your family, your legacy, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and you know, we've been really led down the money trail. Of course, all roads do lead to Rome, and you know, my grandparents came over from the old country, and they just had a simple lifestyle. They grew their own food, and you know, we lived kind of in a rural environment, and everybody lived well into their hundreds, and people were surprised when Grandpa just didn't wake up one morning when he was 106 because he was fine and hunting mushrooms in the hills the day before. So, you know, wealth back then was considered health. You know, it's one and the same. Now it's been really conflated with money. And of course, people aren't doing so well with that. And, you know, I think what I see, what you're doing with your lifestyle and a lot of your projects is, you know, returning to those kind of old school ways. You know, you mentioned education. Have you ever gone online and looked at one of those eighth grade exit exams from the 1800s, late 1800s? There's a famous one. There's more than one, but there's one in particular from Kansas. And it's really fun. I encourage anyone to go look those up and then take it. And most college graduates, even people with a mathematic background, are going to have a hard time, completing that, let alone passing it. And it's just remarkable when you see the level of critical thinking education, and it wasn't just mathematics and your three R's, but it was everything was applying the test questions to real life, as far as how to, plant and figure out seed per acre and, pretty kind of cool stuff. So not only were they way ahead of us as far as their ability to, think on their feet, but also to apply it to something that would actually grow food, allow them to build houses and everything. So I think we've devolved quite a bit. So tell us a little bit about your project there. You're living more on the land and everything now yourself?
Yes, yeah, I was fortunate. I searched for over 2 years to find, a property where I could basically live that kind of self-sufficient lifestyle, should the need arise. Not that I'm necessarily pursuing that all on my own, but of course, I grew up in the concrete jungle, so it's a bit foreign for me to be, on the land like I am. So I'm slowly, learning bushcrafting skills and how to use a chainsaw and, feeling more and more comfortable out there doing those things. And I think, so I've been very interested in health and longevity. And, especially in longevity, I realized that the current data that they tell us about lifespan and such is not really what the human potential is. And it's very, very difficult to know because the data is skewed by many different factors. And also, this is given the modern lifestyle, like the influence of modern culture is now pervasive. There's almost no isolated groups of people that haven't undergone this influence. And I originally, when I was, it was Dr. Wallach's lectures that I was looking at, who talks about trace minerals a lot and their forgotten role, another topic I'm interested in. And he mentioned some old publications where, people lived 120 years or more. And I started looking into that. And that led me to look at more, quote unquote primitive societies, right? Mostly hunter-gatherer societies or hunter-gatherer societies where they have some degree of agriculture. They plant gardens. Of course, nothing like, our big agribusiness today. They had no chemicals or machinery or anything like that. And we don't, so we have different lines of evidence from those civilizations. We have certainly, they didn't keep the same kind of records that we do, so it's very difficult to ascertain what their, mean life expectancy was in those societies. But we have lots of documented cases of people living, over 100 years, over 120 years, and even over 150 years. And some of these cases have been followed by, governments, which adds some validity to the data. There's certainly been lots of efforts of some of the anthropologists doing this research to validate these dates, and sometimes they did record them in different ways. Like there's one culture in the Caucasus where they recorded births on clay pots that they passed from generation to generation, rather than in a Bible or at the church or with a government birth record. But we can also look at other health outcomes from these cultures, and we see that they essentially did not have any knowledge of much of what we think of as illness. So, for example, they had no tooth decay. They had no crooked teeth, right? And we learned a lot of that from Weston A. Price's work. But it's been confirmed by others who have studied these cultures, and we're talking about in North and South America, as well as the Aborigines in Australia for sure, all have these health attributes before Western influence. Now we can also see that it took very, very little time once the Westerners came in, gave them the Western diet and Western medicine, that their health went to shit. but we have those early records of the first contact that they had, so we know. And also there were lots of doctors that went in there and did more thorough examinations, and these people were essentially, seemed like to many of the outsiders like they were Olympic athletes, and I've even seen photographs where they look like this. So what else did they not have? They didn't have stillborn. They didn't have maternal death due to childbirth. They didn't have congenital anomalies like cleft palate and club foot and all of those kinds of things, spina bifida, etc. These were practically unknown. In fact, the only infant or child mortality that most of the leaders of these villages could recall were only accidents, like accidental drowning or snake bite, things like that. No, they didn't have any TB, they didn't have syphilis, they didn't even have the common cold in most of these societies. Okay, so, and then, high blood pressure, heart disease, strokes, autoimmune disease, these things were completely unknown to them. And they had very little, if any, cancer even among these societies. So, and it follows, the lifespan was also very different in terms of functionality, because, we're used to in our modern society that as people age, they start to lose function, right? They need walkers and wheelchairs, and even they become bedridden, they're dependent on dialysis and all these other things. Whereas in those other cultures, people were healthy and vibrant and functional, and then boom, at the end of their life, they just suddenly died, right? Like just in their sleep one night, like one of you guys described earlier, or had a very quick decline over a few days or a week, and then pass away. So it's a much more, fulfilling and natural way of living. And even like wound healing, for example, they didn't really have bacterial infections from wounds. And there's this one, amazing story that was documented about this woman who was injured in a spearing raid, and the spear went entirely through her abdomen from front to back. And they found her, like she was left for dead, but her village found her, brought her back in. They cut the ends off the spear. They packed the ends with mud from the drinking hole of the pessary, which is similar to a pig. So they put pig's mud right on the skin to cover up where they cut the spear, the ends of the spear. She laid, down for about a week to recover. Then she started feeling better, started working, foraging or in the fields again. And then one day, boom, the spear just slid right out of her. And then, all she was left with was a scar in the end, and was, totally normal and fully functional. That's how we should expect to heal from injuries, without the need for any kinds of pharmaceuticals or surgical interventions, in that kind of a case. And that's the potential we have. So in that literature, it also distills a number of lifestyle factors of how they lived. And so I'm trying to, copy those, but, kind of adapt them somewhat to, the modern lifestyle. And, some of these things are just like being outside even when it's not super comfortable. Like making yourself uncomfortable is actually, part of their lifestyle, right? That you don't always have to be in a luxurious, climate-controlled environment, right? Your body, and this, we see modern kind of iterations of this, right? With the famous mountain climber, right, who does the ice baths and the breathing exercises.
Wim Hof.
Wim Hof, yeah, exactly. And I mean, really what he's doing is totally tapped into that aspect of life. It's just that for these cultures, it was just part of their daily life. Like they couldn't avoid it. They didn't have the infrastructure and technology to get whatever nature threw at them, they were exposed to. And because of that, they develop a certain resilience and a certain strength. And, so those are the kind of things I'm trying to integrate and teach other people about.
Yeah. And they didn't
Also,
have go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to add one thing real quick. It's also just being in flow with nature, right? Nature is inherently wild, and with that comes consequences. But also there is a, like Bear was speaking about, this resonance there, and that's why we probably don't see animals coming down with all of these types of diseases and maladies.
Yeah, not until we introduce things into their environment
Yeah.
that bring that about. But yeah, you're absolutely right, and it is the at the root, right? It is the relationship with nature, because you're immersed in a natural environment, right? So the other aspects, right? For example, you're gonna be exposed to all the four alchemical elements that are in nature, right? Air, water, earth, and fire. And right, that means fire, the sun, right? You're going to be out in the sun. One of the issues with our health is we spend too much time shielded from the sun. You're going to be out in natural water, right? If you're fishing, you're going to have at least wade in the water, or you're going to bathe in the natural water, right? Because you don't have an artificial source. And then also, like, you're going to be in sync with the natural rhythms, right? The seasonal patterns, the day-night rhythms. I mean, think of the ubiquity of sleep problems among our modern culture, right? One of the top 10 prescribed drugs are for sleep, right? We're actually like using anesthesia essentially to cause us to sleep, instead of realizing that, oh, one of the biggest reasons why sleep is a problem is because we're not following the natural day-night cycles, light-dark cycles, right? That's what our body's tuned to. And of course, if you're gonna go outside that and make an artificial schedule, then it's going to be problematic.
What's remarkable is, what you're saying about just the contrast between past times and the state of health that we observe just in my career, that was a little more than 40 years treating people. Things that were rare when I was first in practice became epidemic by the time I was through. So it's like everything has been really greatly expedited. The interesting thing, with animals too, you were talking about, where they don't get these sorts of things unless they come in contact with humans. In the field of homeopathy, we recognize these underlying miasmic influences that are the root of what we think of as disease on an energetic level. And it's interesting, and how each, like the cancer, the upper respiratory things, are all really outgrowths of these mindsets that were developed historically when people uh, habituated certain mindsets, generationally. And then you would see animals when they came in contact with humans, through ranching and everything, all of a sudden they started picking up the same afflictions as the humans. And I think, there's a number of things you could attribute to that, just being, kept in captivity. But I think there's also that resonance factor that we're talking about. My own experience working with some old timers from Asia, for many years in the martial arts community. These were people that were well into their 90s and 100. And, we actually were trained by these people and sparred with them. And you'd see these kind of old men that would, punch you, and it felt like you're getting hit with a baseball bat. And they do it with a smile on their face. I could tell Mike's heard a lot of the stories of other amazing things they did, but they would tell us tales of, which I believe are true, back from their oral tradition in the old country up in the hills. There is these valleys, one in particular that was infamous, was known as the Valley of the Ancients. And these were people that cultivated their chi to such a certain extent, and their mindset in the process, their spiritual side, you might even say, to where they live for hundreds of years. So, I think if you don't get your lifestyle in order, which is the most rudimentary thing, then it's really hard to, just enjoy that robust level of health that's going to allow us to maintain a certain focus and the ability to overcome old toxic belief systems and emotions and things. But it definitely does start with the physical body.
Yeah, Barry, what you're saying is definitely key, and it was written about in many of these anthropological works too. That these cultures had a rich spiritual life, right? They had a set of morals and rules that were tied to that, and they were generally much closer to natural law than what we have now in our modern societies. And it provided the inspiration and motivation and meaning for those people from which to derive these lifestyles, right? So, for example, one of the big ways that they thought about the body being a temple, right, and that they have to treat it as such for it to perform. And I know we've heard this concept in our lifetimes, but it doesn't come from any authorities, right? It only kind of comes from the generational wisdom that usually we hear about this, or maybe occasionally from the church. But this was their way of life. And with respect to animals, I think when you were talking, I would be remiss to not bring up the Pottinger cat study, because that only looked at one particular, but probably the most important lifestyle element, which is what we eat, and looking at these cats, and all these cats were in captivity, so that the influence of that was controlled for. Although I do agree that makes a difference, and you can even notice that in my own pets. When I let them go free versus, keep them sheltered. But in that study, for those of you who are not familiar, and there's a book about this, you should definitely learn more. But they had these cats that they were really, doing experiments on, but they had some constraint with their food supply and gave them table scraps and noticed that their health wasn't as good. So they did this controlled experiment where one group of cats, they gave raw meat and raw dairy, and the other group, they gave cooked meat and pasteurized dairy. So they gave them the same food, just prepared a different way. And as you guys know, that the cats that got the cooked meat and the pasteurized dairy started having health problems in the first generation. They were worse in the second generation, and by the third generation, they were essentially sterile and would have gone extinct. And it took 3 generations of putting them back on the raw food and the raw dairy before they got back to their the degree of health they had when they started out. So I think this, I'm not sure how to directly apply this to us as humans, because we clearly know what the natural diet of the house cat is, right? And it's really not even raw dairy, it's just raw meat, because they, no other animals consume dairy of other species besides humans. So, but it had such a profound effect. And it's not like they gave them, processed candy and stuff like that. All they did was cook the meat, and it made such a huge difference. So you can think about, since we've gotten away from natural eating, and I'm not saying that these societies that I'm talking about ate raw meat necessarily. I mean, as far as I know, they mostly cooked their meat. But nevertheless, what we eat is a far cry from what they ate. And just that one lifestyle factor alone has got to have a profound effect on our health, on our level of functioning, and on our longevity.
Yeah, absolutely. Early on, when I was in my athletic career, I experimented quite a bit and tried to be a little scientific about my training and my diet. And what I eventually gravitated to, because it worked and I stayed with it for many years, was the bulk of my diet was raw eggs and raw meat. And it was like being on steroids. It was, yeah, just my body really responded to it.
One of the healthiest and fittest men I've ever met was on a diet like that. In fact, he actually preferred sour raw meat, right, which really means rotten
Yeah.
meat, but he didn't eat all of his meat in that form. And this guy was, pure muscle and no fat. And he was very energetic, his skin complexion was amazing. Like he just looked like a picture of the perfect human specimen. So, it could be that is a lot closer, to our natural diet. There's some interesting things about our physiology that even suggest we may have been somewhat of a scavengers in the past. And because of the high degree of acidity in our stomach really only matches other scavengers like vultures and such. And if we had the ability to make tools, we would have been able to harvest some of the most nutrient dense part of the animals that the other predators couldn't get at, like the bone marrow and the brain, for example.
Yeah, it could be that this is just remnants from the last great deluge and us surviving any way we can. And so there's sort of a, hereditary functionality there going on, right? The few that made it through the last big wipe of the face of the place.
Yeah, if you have a baby, right, that's only been on breast milk, and then when they start to, be interested in solid food, if you put raw meat in front of them, they love it, right? Like I know that most adults now, I mean, Bear, you're kind of an exception, although, there are other people who do this, but most of us might be a little grossed out, by raw meat, but that's something I think we've become a culture to. Just like when you have a baby and you start feeding them solid food, right? That if you try to give them vegetables, they often don't want to eat it, right? Because they're bitter and they're just not appealing. And, it's a lot of parents, I think, struggle with this, trying to like bribe their kids to eat certain foods and whatnot. But if you give those kids meat and eggs, they want it. And if you give them sweet stuff, right, like it could be natural sweet stuff like fruit, they always like that. But they would also like processed, sweet foods, right? But, I think that's one of the windows that we have into what our natural diet is really supposed to be, because it's something that's really, really difficult to determine. And you'll see that there's vigorous debate out in the world and people who specialize in nutrition, and people are very sure of themselves about, what our natural diet is, but they, use the same evidence to come to multiple different conclusions, or they cherry pick certain things and ignore certain other things. And, it's a very difficult determination to make. But if we look at, what are the diet of these people who had amazing health, they all held meat in a high regard. Like they were willing to put more effort and had more value in getting meat on their dinner plate than any other food. There were some, societies due to environmental constraints, like the Inuit, for example, that really had a completely carnivorous diet. And then there were, other places, depending on where they lived, that it was much harder to, get meat. And so they had less of it in their diet, but they all had a high importance. And also some of these cultures had a very simple diet with almost no variation, right? Like there's a famous, he was originally a Harvard professor, and then he quit to go and do expeditions in the Arctic, because he thought that was the only way he could really learn rather than being in a classroom. And he spent, I think, total of 11 years in the Arctic Circle with the Inuit, eating their diet. And then he and another professor actually, in a controlled experiment, subjected themselves to this kind of diet for a whole year to measure their outcomes. But for the first 6 months he was describing this, he ate only this one specific type of fish, the salmon trout. Now they had it prepared, they ate it raw, they boiled it, they dried it, and they ate it rotten. And for the first few months, he avoided eating it rotten at all, ate it the other ways. And after a while, like he said, after 6 months, he didn't want any other food. He was very content to just eat that one kind of fish. And after a few months, he tried it rotten. And he said the first time he tried it, it smelled better than camembert. And then that ended up being his favorite way to eat it. So this is very foreign to us. Like in our culture, we think we need tons of variety. We're always like craving different foods and such like that. But if we look at, what's a natural way to eat, and similarly, many of the North American peoples, they had only two foods. They had buffalo meat and they had maize. And that's pretty much all they ate. And I think the proportions depending on the harvest time of year and such. But we don't have any understanding of what our natural way of eating is. And also, I mean, if we look at all of the fruits and vegetables that you could buy at the supermarket now, none of those even closely really resemble what we would find just growing in nature without human influence. All those varieties have been, highly modified through, selective hybridization and crossbreeding and things like that before, molecular genetics started to do the job. But even if we look at something in the modern era, like from when I was a kid, Brussels sprouts were bitter, right? And no kids liked them, right? They weren't very popular at all. They were kind of like thought to be a health food, but not a tasty one. And then, sometime in the last 20 years, I think there was a farmer in the Netherlands who, through selective hybridization, developed a variety of Brussels sprouts that were sweet. And then it took very little time that every farmer who is cultivating Brussels sprouts around the world was now using that cultivar only. And now, like I could see with my kids, oh, we love Brussels sprouts. And why do we love them? Because they basically are engineered now to have a bunch of sugar in them, right? But that's not how they were. I mean, they're brassica, right? If we look at what brassica was in the wild, it was this little teeny super bitter cabbage that probably no one would eat.
I brought this up last week, and you're mentioning, the sense of smell, which I think is overlooked as a very important faculty. And when we had our largest clinic, people used to come and be with us for extended stays because we had live-in units. And we had a couple times a day where we put out like a big table where people would come to eat, and everything was raw, everything from animal products to fruits, vegetables. And what they're required to do is to smell everything. And they only ate what smelled good. And, we took a cue from a French clinic that was doing this back in the day, and they called it the instinctual diet. It worked very well for us and for our clients. And so I've always been a proponent of the instinctual diet ever since. I really don't like conforming to somebody's theories or ideas. It's like, well, you've got a nose, before no matter how you prepare your food, smell it. And then a lot of people just ended up eating things raw in the first place. So one thing I wanted to ask you though, my diet's changed dramatically. I don't even eat meat, for many years now. And it's not because I'm anti-carnivore or feel it's evil or bad for me or anything, but I'd like to get your thoughts. I think as you go through different phases or maybe even different stages of development, as far as, I don't know how else to put it, just your inner awareness, I think there is a possibility of needing less and less density to sustain you, when you developed other faculties or parts of yourself. And I still like to eat raw eggs. I have a couple raw eggs every morning. And, so it's not like I'm adverse to animal products, but just more gravitating to kind of raw fruits and other things and a little raw dairy and everything, and let the meat go. And I feel fine. I'm not, as muscularized as I was like 50 years ago, but I feel healthier in other ways. So do you think it's possible when we go through, different levels of development or phases of life where we have different needs in our body?
Yeah, well, of course, absolutely. And, and also I think probably if you didn't eat those eggs, you wouldn't be doing as well in your health, right? Because
Mhm.
that gives you a lot of the things you can't get from the fruits and vegetables.
Mhm.
Absolutely, there's individual differences just among individuals, and there's some good even frameworks to look at this. Like Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez, for example, has a theory that he used very successfully to help people with their health. That's based on your basically sympathetic tone, right? That and it's kind of derived from where your ancestors live geographically, and that's something I was already pointing out before, right? That a lot of the optimal diet for these different groups of people depended on where they were geographically, because that was determined what food sources were available. There was no food distribution network like we have now, where you can get anything from anywhere in the world any time of year. So they were, somewhat limited, and perhaps over time, they adapted more to that. So there's individual differences in terms of the best, optimum mix of different types of nutrients. And then, as you pointed out, our needs change, depending, and not just over the course of our lifetime, but, even within short windows of our lifetime, depending on our activity, what the climate is like where we are, and many other things. So if you're like in your younger years, Bear, when you were focused on athletics and sports and bodybuilding and stuff, you probably would have had different needs from your body than you do now, depending on your goals. And so all that makes a lot of sense. And one of the concepts that I talk about a lot, which has been we've lost touch with many of our body's signals and information that's provide us. Like, we don't just eat when we're hungry, right? We eat to derive pleasure. We eat to alleviate stress, right? Many other purposes. Most people have completely lost touch with their thirst mechanism, right? They've misinterpreted many other body signals like twinges and pain and things like this. And one of the most important things is to reestablish that, listening to your body's signals and having that back and forth communication, so that what the proper, diet. And I like that idea of using, olfaction as a way to, what's appetite out of all these foods that are all, provide nutrients and are not full of poisons, right? Which is appealing to you based on the scent. And there's also, like this assay to help detect mineral deficiencies, where you would take, weak mineral solutions of, one mineral at a time, place it on your tongue, and then depending on how it tastes, if it tastes neutral or sweet, that could indicate you're deficient in that mineral, where if it tastes bitter, then you're already replete, with that mineral. So the same thing with your sense of smell. And I'm sure also the tongue feel and the experience once you put that food in your mouth is going to confirm what your interpretation of the sense of smell of that food. So yeah, using these kind of procedures to help your body reestablish that. And you might be able to get a point where you don't necessarily even have to be exposed to the food. You just get the signal from your body, it needs this, and then you give it that type of a food. And it's key to reestablishing, especially with hydration. There's this big debate, you need to drink 8 glasses. No, it has to be a gallon. No, people are drinking too much water, right? All this kind of stuff. If you can understand and respond to your thirst, you don't have to worry about any of that, because your body will tell you exactly how much water to drink. And one of the things you mentioned about raw food that's often overlooked is raw foods actually contain a much higher water content than cooked foods, right? Because when we heat something, we're evaporating the water out of it. So if you eat raw foods, you're going to need to drink less water overall, right? And your thirst will tell you that when you're doing that. And this is why, we see animals in the wild drinking less than we do, because they only eat raw food, right? There's no animal that knows how to cook its food. Only pets that we feed dry food to, they're the only ones who are, eating dehydrated food.
There's a couple of raccoons out there that are barbecuing, but
Well, if you leave barbecue scraps in your trash, they will eat that.
good old trash pandas. Yeah, the structured water too element to that, right? So you're getting a highly structured water, in your raw food. So that's that qualitative side, right? It's really important. And I do see here a concurrent theme, though, like going back to this idea of the freedom terrain, which is the inner knowingness of who you are, and really being tapped into that will allow one to get out of this need to look to these sources, the officialdom to tell them what the best diet is or how many glasses of water to drink. It's inside of you, but it takes work to know who you are. Would you say that's pretty fair statement?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so when, there are some times, right, when adopting a temporary type of diet is necessary, in other words, to kind of stimulate your body into healing, right? I'm talking about elimination diets. But that's not really a way to live the rest of your life, but it's a springboard that you can, improve your health and then be in a situation where you can reestablish the connection as you're going through the healing process. One thing I noticed the first time I ever did any kind of healing protocol, and it was based on Kelly Brogan's book, A Mind of Your Own. And it was just an elimination diet. And I did this with someone I was trying to help to, see if this would actually make a difference. And so I did this for 30 days and a lot of things that I didn't even think were really a problem improved. But I noticed something that now many, many clients have also had the same experience, that after I did that for 30 days, and then I tried a food that I had eaten before or a drink that I had had before, my body gave me a clear signal in how it liked or didn't like that particular food. And some of these things were like really surprised me. Like I had a cup of mint tea, right? Just basically organic mint leaves that I made some tea with. And my body did not like that at all. It gave me acid reflux, right? Which I didn't, the whole 30 days, I didn't have that experience at all. I have a few sips of this tea and my body gives me that feedback. And I had no idea that my body did not like mint. Whereas the things that are said to typically cause reflux, like acidic foods, things like coffee and tomato sauce, those things my body liked. Like I didn't have any untoward signals from the body, right? But it was only after doing this and being really clean that my body gave me these clear signals. Before that, I could put any kind of junk in my mouth and it would almost virtually be no reaction from my body unless I, really gorged myself or something like that.
Interesting. So, Shilajit, I'd like to talk about that a little bit, and Ayurvedic medicine, of course, is considered the supreme tonic. Over the years, I adapted using it, with my clients, and I think it's one of the most important things that as far as supplementation and people could do. So could you speak a little bit about why that may or may not be a great thing for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my favorite topics. First of all, let me just start off by saying that, many people, once they realize allopathic medicine is not providing the right answers, they go outside that system, but they kind of adopt the same mentality of like, we need pills for health. And they start taking all these supplements without, whenever I talk to people individually, they don't even know why, what the reason. They're just like, well, someone said it was good, so I added it to the list of, 12 other things. And I'm very much against this philosophy. My opinion is that there should be a clear reason, a clear purpose for everyone. But as I learn more and more about health, I realize that, no one is getting enough trace minerals because they're just not in the food supply. And, there are many reasons for this, using essentially chemical farming, monocrops, growing the food in one place and then consuming it in another place far away, and just a lack of attention to the role of these. I mean, the reason why agriculture has to use all these chemicals is because all the plants that they're growing for food are unhealthy, and they're basically trying to keep them alive. Instead of trying to make them healthier and more resistant to the reasons they use chemicals, right? They just are caught up in this kind of chemical warfare type of game. So we've got lots of evidence that the trace minerals have diminished in the food. There's pervasive insufficiencies in the amount of trace minerals. And Shilajit is, in my opinion, the most natural way to replenish these, other than putting them back in our food supply, which you can actually use Shilajit to do also. If you're going to grow your own food, you can use it as a soil amendment, and I have some instructions on how to do that if anyone is interested. But Shilajit also has other benefits, and I'll get into that after I tell you what it is. So and also how they locate sources of this in nature. But as you mentioned, it's been pervasive in Ayurvedic medicine going back thousands of years, but not just in Ayurvedic, also in Russian folk medicine, which I'm not sure of the exact name of, and in many other areas with mountainous regions. And this Shilajit it's like a dirt-like substance, and it contains a variety of minerals in very small amounts, like sometimes 50 or more different minerals, and fulvic acid and humic acids. So it's derived from plants. Those are substances that are sort of made either by bacteria or plants that are involved in plant physiology. And so it's said to be like the remnants of an ancient decomposed forest. And it is, also said to go through some geological, pressure, heat, and time, and especially in areas where mountains are formed. And you can find outcroppings of this material in mountainous regions at, some are at a very high altitude, like the Shilajit that I sell is harvested all at, I think, above 14,000 feet altitude. And the way that they traditionally locate these sources is by, after it rains, following the animals, because the water dissolves some of this and they lick it up, right? And this is a way for them to get more minerals, just like, we are familiar with animals seeking out a salt lick to get enough salt, depending on, their local food sources, etc. But because it has the fulvic acids in it as well, they can chelate heavy metals, and there's this phenomenon of toxic metal substitution that it's quite interesting, but there's a lot of research on it now. So we have sort of got into this situation through our modern food production system, where we have minor deficiencies in these minerals, not such a gross deficiency to make us overtly sick from a mineral deficiency point of view, but to affect our health, making it suboptimal. These minerals they're used as parts of proteins in our body, and it's widely agreed that at least over half of all the proteins in our body use these mineral cofactors, either to optimize their function as an enzyme, or to help them form the right structure, or to bind other things, like the iron in hemoglobin binds oxygen, as one example, and there are many others. But if we're somewhat deficient in these in our body, our proteins can actually utilize other metals that might be in similar places on the periodic table. And for example, it can use lead as a substitute for zinc. And when we're exposed to lead and we don't have enough zinc, our body's proteins will use the lead. And it actually helps us to some degree, because it's better to have lead than nothing. But let's say that the enzyme has 100% activity with zinc, and it only has 20% with lead. So we're having suboptimal performance as a result of this substitution. And then in addition, we know, lead is an oxidant, and it can cause damage to the local, molecules in the area where it's at. So it can hurt us in that way, even though it gives us kind of some degree of functioning. Now, when we replete the zinc, let's say in that example, which would be in shilajit, our body prefers the zinc, and the protein prefers the zinc, so it's going to kick out the lead. Now, the lead, if we just take zinc, right, then now that lead is free to do damage somewhere in our body. But if we provide shilajit, which has the zinc chelated to the fulvic acid, well, essentially what happens is the zinc gets exchanged for the lead. So the zinc goes into our proteins, and then the lead goes into the fulvic acid, and then it can actually be removed from our body. So this is a major, major advantage to using this type of a trace mineral supplement versus if we just get, a regular zinc supplement or a multi-mineral type of supplement. Now, there are other ways that minerals can have better absorption and better function, but this is the most natural and potent way. And then we know that it has other benefits. We don't know the exact mechanism, if it's through the minerals and the chelation or through other properties, because it has been shown also to have a lot of antioxidant properties, which often is associated with improving our health. But what the studies that are out there, and they're somewhat limited, is that it improves blood sugar management in people with diabetes, and that it improves sexual functioning, both in libido, erectile function, and increases testosterone levels. So, and all of that is probably, whatever the underlying mechanism, it's probably one mechanism that it helps with all those issues. So it's an extremely helpful substance. It's a way to get the minerals that we really just can't get from our diet unless we purposely grow our own food and make sure that we do things to increase the mineral content. So, in my opinion, it's the one substance that would benefit everyone if they took it at an ongoing basis, unless you have, another type of solution to achieve this. So that's why I talk about it all the time. And, the more I look into it, the more health problems I see are related to mineral deficiencies, and the more, even in the mainstream studies that come out, I mean, you can even find studies looking at heart disease where it talks about copper deficiency. We know that, most people don't have enough collagen, and that's related to many of the musculoskeletal problems and the chronic arthritis. And, you need minerals in order to manufacture collagen. I mean, you need other things too, like, people aren't getting enough glycine. We can talk about other nutritional types of deficiencies, but no one's getting enough minerals unless they are taking something like shilajit or fulvic minerals.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I want to know what you think about this. I believe we live in a larger realm that actually is a technology of sorts. It's a functional realm. And minerals, if you look at it as an electrical apparatus, this technology, the minerals on the south pole of the realm are the capacitors, if you liken it to an electrical system. And I believe these minerals pick up resonance from perhaps larger bodies over our head that, part of this functional technology. And, like, for instance, when you get into the realm of cell salts and so forth, we talk about how the informational fields from these higher sources of resonance are actually stored in these mineral elements, of which, of course, shilajit would be a rich source of those. And then that, in turn, gives the cells of our body the information they need, as well as the materials, in order to build every single form and function in our body. So I think there's even a deeper element to this, besides just the molecular aspect, which is very important. But I think there's this other attribute to minerals that a lot of people don't normally consider. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting point. And I mean, let me first say that one of the most important, aspects that we've discovered about our health is that, and this is, largely ignored in mainstream medical research, is that our electrical properties are super, super important. I mean, we definitely, know, and no one would disagree, even in mainstream biology, that the resting membrane potential, right, shows that if a cell's alive or not. Once the voltage of a cell goes down to zero, that cell is dead. And how does a cell maintain a potential? Well, it has to have charged substances of some point that have an opposite charge on inside the cell versus outside the cell. And what provides those charges are minerals. In fact, we even call them electrolytes, right, because of those
Right.
electrical properties. Now, so they're definitely necessary for maintaining potentials, and they act within water to achieve that, and the properties of water aid that as well. Now, in terms of the informational field, that is an area I don't think we really have much empirical evidence to go on, but this is an area that deserves a lot of effort in that realm to research it, because if we look at the complexity of our physiology, I mean, even if we just do it at the chemical level, right, the number of different chemical reactions that are occurring within just each cell, and then having trillion cells in the body, and they're all doing different chemistry at the same time, but at the right time to help us, be prepared to deal with whatever is going on in our environment and our activity. It's far beyond any computational abilities that we have in terms of our hardware, right? It far exceeds the brain capacity to coordinate all those things at the level of organization that they're coordinated. So in my opinion, that begs that there's got to be an external information source. And so that we could talk about what is the information source. Like, could it be the Schumann resonance, for example, right, the natural frequency output of the Earth, or could there be other things? Could there be stuff coming from the other side of the firmament or whatever, right? We can explore that, but certainly we can detect all sorts of natural vibrations. And then what is the receiver or the antenna, or the transducer that picks up that information from the field and translates it into instructions and information for our body to function. And certainly the minerals could act as an antenna in some way for that signal, and I think that water could actually contain the information, right? Because we've seen from other research that water can contain information and even process information and language and things like that. So we could, definitely develop some theoretical models that we could do empirical testing. But I think, there's got to be some source of all this information, and nobody really knows, and no one who's got funded research is really looking into this. But it's a key aspect, because so much flows from this. And we mentioned Jerry Marzinski before, and I know Steve brought him up in your recent podcast, but that's kind of what he's getting at, is that that with people with chronic psychotic illness, that there's essentially a corruption of the information coming in, and maybe by possession of some entity or some other corrupting force. But I think that explanation lends itself to his process in an overall way. And so we do have some indirect evidence that we can make inferences from along these lines.
So go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say, though, unfortunately, I think we've lost a lot of the data where scientists of yesterday that were actually engaging in a more vitalistic, qualitative science of empirical study, a la the alchemists, were quite familiar with how these operations worked and were doing transmutation that was noted, that was documented, that had been seen, and had caused some of them some great strife, actually. And there's some really fantastic historical stories about some of these characters, like well, John D in some respect, but I'm trying to think of the other cat who was at the same time as John D. It's falling out of my head right now. But it's interesting, Andy. It's like, yeah, how far we've fallen from this vitalistic approach to biology, where it wasn't that long ago, 100 years ago, where there was a grander understanding that we weren't just this mechanistic machine of chemical interactions and reaction, and that was all downstream, right, from this life principle of that was an animative force that was coming from soul and spirit. And so, yeah, I think that's something that's exciting, as I do believe we have an opportunity here to bring that back into science. And there are biologists like Michael Levin, if you're familiar with him, who is engaging in some more of this work where he's going back into sort of the electrical properties of the cells and getting away from the purely chemical side to see that this animating force is, driving certain things around how biology builds out life and stuff. But yeah, I would be interested to try to relate back to those older alchemical papers to see if we can pull those out still from the dusty shelves of the archaic times, to see if there were valid empirical studies that were observed and seen by those alchemists to show that we could see this animating force in a more empirical way.
Well, there is one area of modern research that I think gets very close to this, although it's not taken very seriously because I think it detracts from the pharmaceutical model. But I'm talking about the placebo, nocebo research, right? Because there you can influence, profound changes in someone's health and physiology without, invoking any physical interventions whatsoever, right? All informational, really, and belief, and it can have, even to the point of saving your life or ending your life, depending on which type of effect, right? And that it doesn't get more potent than that in terms of influence.
There's also technologies that, of course, haven't been conventionally proven, but for a lot of people that use those technologies, like Lecker antennas and even meters at Wilhelm Reich. I have one that was gifted to me, used to measure orgone activity, life force, whatever you want to call it. But a lot of these more analog technologies require that the practitioner attune themselves with this, because there's not an electrical source, animating the technology. So biogeometry is, radiesthesia, all those sorts of things. I feel they're very real, just having done them for a long time. But they do give you feedback in ways that I think are extremely valid, and maybe even more valid than the types of technologies we use to measure in the conventional world, because you're taking out that element that can mask a lot of those forces that Michael is alluding to there. So there's one other element to the mineral discussion I'd like to throw in there, just for the heck of it, to get your feedback. And that is the transitional elements. And now this gets a little bit more into the waveform theories and so forth, and understanding that the keynotes, or the elements on a periodic table, are not necessarily fixed, and that there are subtones within those keynotes, between the keynotes, and that in fact, just like in music, that's where all the good information, is carried, that, gives you that richness, that we hear, in a recording or in a live performance. So, any thoughts about transitional elements, which some people call ormus, which I think is a misnomer because then it brings you back into atomic theory and so forth. The transitional elements, I think, are also very plentiful in Shilajit, whereas other mineral forms or mineral supplements, or even eating good organic food because of the inherent deficiencies in the soil, probably not so much. And there are some folks, myself included, that believe these transitional elements lend a certain uh, beneficial attribute to our neurology and help coach it back to its original state of superconductivity where there's less information lost in the transmission of signals. So I don't know if you dabbled in that world or not.
Well, maybe not at exactly the same level that you're talking about, but one thing is, I have observed from customer feedback that it's very common that people have improvements in their cognitive abilities when they take these metals, so I'm gonna assume you're talking about like the transitional earth metals when you say transitional
Yeah,
metals, like
especially the gold and platinum group.
gold and platinum group. So I've got a periodic table
Hmm.
in front of me now, and I know that a lot of the so we don't. Let me just frame this a little bit. And there's minerals that are called essential, right? That already there is enough evidence saying that we need to have these minerals because they've been found in many of our proteins and enzymes in the body. But it's by no means a complete list because they have not nearly exhausted the possible minerals and not nearly have characterized all the metalloproteins in our body. And in fact, they also neglected to include essential minerals for the bacterial species that live in our body. So, one thing I've been able to do is add those minerals. So like, for example, vanadium, which is not considered an essential mineral for us, but it is for bacterial species that live in our body. So therefore we need it too. And so it's quite possible that there are, a number of more like that we actually do need. So like if we look at gold and platinum, which you mentioned, and go in that column. So above gold, we have silver and then we have copper. Now, with silver, we don't really have evidence that's essential. We do have some evidence of some toxicity of silver, but it's not really fully explored. And one of the other things to know is that, and I think this speaks to what you're talking about, is that there are different forms of these elements. So there are different isotopes, but also different oxidation states, more importantly. And when we're exposed to something from an industrial source, like for example, the aluminum oxide that's added to vaccines, that's very different from the aluminum that we might find naturally in the soil in small amounts. And it's going to have a very different effect on your body in those different forms. I mean, even if it's from nature versus made in a factory, it's going to have different properties, even if it's exactly the same. Like we remember Béchamp's experiment on chalk, for example, that when he had natural chalk taken from the earth, he was able to get fermentation to take place, but manufactured chalk, there was no fermentation.
Right.
So there's definitely those kind of variabilities. But if we go up further, we find copper, and copper is, no one would contest the fact that that is an essential mineral. And then if we go above platinum, we find palladium and then nickel. Now, nickel is one that's considered a toxic metal by most, authorities these days, but it is an essential mineral for some of the bacterial species that live in our body. So, is it a poison or essential? I would say it's essential. And, all of these things, right? Because, we know this from the famous Paracelsus quote, right? Everything is a poison depending on the amount. And a lot of times when I actually criticize certain things like methylene blue that I would consider as more of a poison than a remedy, that people confront me with this. Oh, well, even water is, poisonous based on the amount, but the actual amount is really important because obviously we couldn't survive without water. We're made of 70% roughly water by volume. The amount of water that we have to drink for water to become poisonous is nearly impossible to drink. Right? Like now you can do it intravenously, no problem. But if you try to drink that amount, it's going to be really, really tough. You're going to have to like fight vomiting in order to drink enough water to be poisonous. Whereas with methylene blue, if you take 100 milligrams too much, it's poisonous. Right? So, so we have to look at those kind of things. So with nickel, what form is it in? Is it in a form like it is in nature, like we might find it in shilajit or in soil? Or is it in an industrial form and then it has, different interaction with the body? Is it natural or is it synthetic? And those things really matter. And, what's the difference, right? If we have, like, go back to that chalk, or we could take a mineral, like if we have the zinc that is, dug up from the ground versus a zinc supplement that's made in a factory, right? It could be the exact same compound, same oxidation state and such, but it would have a different effect on the body, right? I mean, one thing the body is going to say, oh, yes, you're putting something from nature in me that I need, thank you. And then the other time it's synthetic, we put that in our body says, what is that? It kind of looks like something from nature, but it's different also. Is it, what do we do with it? And just that, kind of questioning that might come from our physiology makes it a potential, hazard, or
Yeah.
at least not as effective as it could be.
I was actually wanting to have a discussion with you. I was going to call you in private and ask you about the methylene blue discussion. If we just hold on to that thought for a second and we go back to it. The transitional element, just to complete that, I first became aware of this through a soil scientist. His name was David Hudson. Have you ever heard of his name?
Doesn't
So
sound
in
familiar.
1989-90, this soil scientist, he was in an agricultural process. He was recovering certain elements for different purposes, and he was concentrating these things from soil. And when he got certain elements concentrated to a certain extent, he would notice they were doing very strange things. Like actually, some of them would float and defy the laws of physics and do other things that were not what we consider normal. And that's where he first coined the term ORMUS, orbitally rearranged monatomic elements, because he's trying to make it fit the atomic thing. So I was heard of this through the grapevine. So I arranged a meeting where he came out to my place in Maui, and we had a little gathering, worked with them for a little bit. And so he was at that point showing how to recover some of these certain minerals. We found that aloe concentrates were a rich source, and I was a test group of doctors where we'd, use these concentrated forms of aloe in order to deliver high concentrations of this alleged ormus, which I now call transitional elements. But he explained them as ceramic state and not in a metallic state. They're not isotopes. They're a whole different thing. And then it would, I've tried to make it conform just my own theories to, waveform mechanics with Walter Russell and so forth, where because he talks about everything, always being in a state of becoming the next thing. In my practice, and again, this is just anecdotal, can't prove anything, but it seems that it really does do some beneficial things to the nervous system, especially stimulating pineal activity and so forth. And then, of course, there's a lot of extrapolations, also theoretical, that this, goes back to stories of mana and, this sacred substance and everything. Again, all completely unable to prove. But I kind of have a belief system in some of that. So anyway, that's where I was going with the transitional elements. All that you pointed out is great information as well. So
And real quick, Bear, I mean,
Yeah.
can't we sort of relate that to alchemy, right? And this idea of transmutation. Edward Kelly was, by the way, the alchemist. I was trying to remember.
Oh, okay.
And his supposedly there was a historic precedence that he showed transmutation of lead to gold to Emperor Rudolph II. And there's actually historical evidence that he was imprisoned because he refused to tell Rudolph II how to do that, because the last thing he wants is some emperor to know how to make gold, control the world. And then he escaped from prison, broke his leg, lost his leg. And then there's a fantastic story. I highly recommend looking into it. But this is sort of how I see alchemy actually working, is that, as we've talked about this with Steve last week, right? It's moving through the tonal fields of the vibrational sort of aspects and attributes of these elements. And of course, we see on the elemental chart, it's all about, how many electrons it has and sort of all of this math, right? But that's all theoretical. They've never actually seen that function or that form, right, within these elements. They will claim that they can, sort of see these a bit with electron scanning microscope, but there is no fundamental live view of these actual structures on that scale. So it is all theoretical. And we talked last week about Walter Russell, right, and how his chart is more about the tonal fields and sort of relating it to music. And it does make sense when we look at cymatics and we actually see sort of how crystals work and everything, that this intuitively, at least to me, seems to make more sense, that we are, the way this transmutation, if this historically, these stories are true, that this was actually working through sort of the tonal fields and almost like playing the notes as a musician would, going harmonically from from note to note in a sort of symphony of playing those fields and those notes. And so that for me seems to make more sense than sort of the electrons being transferred back and forth. I don't know.
Well,
Well,
it's all
Mike,
theoretical.
yeah, and I kind of had a little bit of a realization about this over the past months, because my son was studying chemistry for high school. He's doing this at home, and I was, recruited to help him a lot. That was one of my best subjects when I was younger, and obviously it kind of contributes to this discussion. But what I finally realized is that the way that chemistry, is understood as a discipline is very much like mathematics. It's really a symbol of, it's a system of coding and symbols. And it's internally consistent, and it may be useful for the purpose of making new things, or at some cursory level of understanding or description, but it really has no explanatory power. And similarly, what you described about, using frequency or tonality, I think also it's more descriptive rather than explanatory. And the more that I look into all of the, theoretical frameworks that we understand, biology and the physical natural world, substances, etc., is that, all the things I thought we knew, they're all wrong. They're all guesses, they're stories, they're models, but they're not proven, right? Even just the structure of the cell and what the organelles are and the membrane, right, is not correct. So it's really difficult to have a higher level of understanding. But if we apply alchemical principles to this, we bypass all that. We can understand it intuitively and based on observation. And I think get a much richer knowledge and understanding of how all these things, work in nature. Now, it also doesn't necessarily provide us explanatory power, but it makes us less worried about the importance of that, because we can use it in a practical way, right? And we know that so we know, for example, we can identify different substances we don't need to know, the molecular formula of those substances to understand them. And we can also understand, where they came from if they're not a primary kind of substance, right? Or a primary element. For example, when we see water, we can recognize and identify water, and many, many other things. And we also, this idea about alchemical transformation or transmutation, that one thing is created from something else. Obviously, the mainstream tries to make this seem like some kind of magic that's just a made-up story with the lead into gold thing, even though that may have actually been really accomplished. But the mainstream, on the other hand, has radioactive decay, where one element becomes another element. And what's the difference between that and turning lead into gold? And certainly within our body, we recognize, everything gets turned into something else, right? What do we put in our body's breath? We put food, we put water, and then those things our body turns into our body, right? And those things are very different. If we can eat a leaf of lettuce, it doesn't resemble our body at all, and yet our body turns it into some part of our body, right? And that is a transformation. And we can even look at this at a molecular level on something like gluconeogenesis, right? Which, even if we look at what that name means, right, it means the creation of new sugar, right? Well, how do we create that? Well, we take amino acids, and our body does this automatically and turns them into sugar. It takes one thing and turns it into something totally different, right? That is alchemy. There's no point in denying that, and it's a way to really understand it in a much more rich manner, without the delusion of having atomic theory and everything related to that, and quantum mechanics try to help us understand it, when those things are just incorrect.
Yeah, going back to Ayurvedic medicine, for eons they had certain practices. One notable, is they put salt in everything, and one individual who wrote a book about the transmutation of elements, and he learned through the Ayurvedic system that he thought at first it was just to retain fluids, and they said, well, no, it's actually to keep you cool, because the sodium is actually transmuted into potassium. That keeps you cool. And then, it ended up where he wrote a whole book about all the different things that we take internally. Like, I make certain things to help people with calcium metabolism, but we don't give them calcium. We put different things that create a certain pH, but then also make sure there's a rich source of silica, because in the body, silica is transmuted into the calcium, and just giving it calcium isn't the way to get calcium. So the body does do these things, I'm pretty convinced. One other thing there is in a laboratory, I do this myself right where I'm sitting here. In the past, I've taken rainwater, filtered rainwater, and in everything in an alchemical process, it's always, separating everything into these three components. We have different names for them and everything. It doesn't matter. But
Three
then each of these
philosophies.
each of these components, that we can separate out of rainwater, then we, like for instance, you'll get the salt of rainwater, and then you'll do the mercury of the salt of the salt, the sulfur of the salt, and you do this for each of the different components. So you have all these different factions at the end, in different containers. It went through all these processes. Nothing was ever added or subtracted. It's just still rainwater, but then they all do different things as a real medicine. And they also can be demonstrated to have different measurements, as far as pH changes and other things. So I think if conventional science, as we think of it, would participate in some of these things, we would get more what we would think, valid information and proof that there's actually something going on behind the scenes there that we haven't considered before.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned water, because that's an area where, we know a lot more now, but it's not integrated into the mainstream view at all. And the fact that, you can do things to water, not adding or subtracting anything, as you mentioned, and get very different physical properties out of that water, like a different pH. You can even have like water that's charged in a
Right.
glass that's not neutral, right? Which kind of defies the typical knowledge completely, but it's been empirically demonstrated. It's not hard to demonstrate. Other properties like the viscosity, etc., like different physical and chemical properties of water, and it's just water with nothing added or subtracted. So there is a lot of richness to these kind of approaches, but you have to be able to step out of the main dogma, of the field, and this is why we're finding it difficult, to amass this knowledge at a satisfactory rate. It's really slow, and you have folks like us that if if we could get a couple of $1 million and a nice lab facility, we would probably dive in and do these experiments. But the likelihood of that happening is pretty slim.
Yeah. So, Annie, you've been extremely generous with your time here, and I don't want to keep you too much over, but how about for wrapping things up? Methylene blue, what's up there?
Well, methylene blue is interesting because it was the first synthetic chemical that was ever used or marketed as a pharmaceutical. So it sort of, started the mold of that. And it was also commercialized by a company, BASF, that later was part of the main, IG Farben Nazi conglomerate. And I think that it was heavily involved in what was going on in that part of the world at that time. And the chemical industry was born to create dyes. And the reason is because there was a limitation on natural dyes for things like textiles and also for staining things under the microscope, because that was a growing field of exploration. And so the chemical industry figured out they could make very colorful things that would have wide applications. Now, many of them turned out to be very poisonous. Like if anyone's heard about Paris green, a very fashionable paint color that was based on an arsenical compound and caused a lot of illness, for example. And also, this is where antibiotics came from, because when they were using some of these dyes to stain, cell cultures, and they noticed that the microorganisms died when they put these dyes in there. And so that's how they were developed into antibiotics. And if you look at antibiotic capsules, for example, you'll see that those little particles are often brightly colored, right? Because, anyone remember taking that amoxicillin as a kid, that liquid, it was always pink, right? So there's this connection, and some of those dyes, the first ones were the first sulfa drugs other than methylene blue, and methylene blue is still used as a dye. In fact, it's used in surgery like sentinel node biopsies and breast cancer surgery, for example, where they put a drop of it where the tumor is, and then it gets taken up by the lymph and shows them which lymph node is draining the area where the tumor was, right? So, and that may be a useful application with only exposure to a small amount, although I'm not saying surgery is a good thing for breast cancer. But that at least makes sense. But it's also, it's been used, interestingly, for a pretty rare condition called methemoglobinemia, which is usually caused by exposure to some kind of poison. But here's the thing, it actually can cause methemoglobinemia as well as supposedly ameliorate it. So that seems to me to be somewhat problematic and not really a good thing. And there's many other toxicities, but it's become like a trend. And I think, RFK definitely has something to do with this, because there are those like, sort of paparazzi photos of him taking this substance on an airplane and such, and he may have even promoted it, and there are other health influencers promoting it, but there's really no good data that it's useful. And being that it comes from this kind of background and it clearly has toxicity, it can cause serotonin syndrome and many other problems. And in my mind, it's like basically a trap for people who are trying to get out of the system. And, very similar to some of the other pharmaceutical traps, like like ivermectin, which people attribute to now. They say it's like a miracle cure for all kinds of things, and cancer and such. And meanwhile, it's really just another pharmaceutical poison. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, you mentioned ivermectin. Back when I was treating a lot of folks who would come in with a cancer terrain, there's a woman by the name of Hulda Clark that had the famous zapper. Did you ever hear of that? Where it supposedly killed parasites, when a person's terrain was compromised, we understood that it also became rife with opportunistic organisms that aren't bad. They're in everybody, but then they would just, go into the terrain and have their way a little bit more than normal, including parasites. And we found that sometimes the parasites, if they're overly prolific, we'd use something like turpentine, in order to dampen them down naturally. And then there's just less, parasites dumping toxicity and robbing nutrition. And it helped people, it helped widen our window of opportunity to help these people recover their health from the cancer terrain. And so, I explained to folks that, well, the ivermectin is probably doing something like that. Your terrain is probably out of order. Maybe these opportunistic organisms are having the way. So temporarily, you might feel a little bit better, but you don't, it's not a cure-all and really not fixing what you think it's fixing. And if you wanted to do something along that line, you'd be better off taking turpentine or something. But back to methylene blue, of course, the proponents are saying, well, it's, prepping the mitochondria for, increasing energy. I had some similar concerns that you're mentioning because some of the conditions, even though they say are rare, it is a possibility. I had my own little trial with it, because I'd like to use myself as a guinea pig for everything. And but I just intuitively, it felt like, well, maybe not the best thing to stay on long term. Now we've got Alex Jones is out there really pushing it heavily in his company as well. So it seems like there's a second wave of this trend. So you feel like the possible risk and downside, I think I agree with you, that we're really trying to game the system a little bit by interjecting with these kinds of substances rather than just going into good terrain management, lifestyle, thinking double plus happy thoughts and breathing fresh air. So, yeah. So I'm kind of iffy about the whole thing myself right now.
Well, you brought up a lot of good points there, and there's very little evidence of benefits from methylene blue for what people say, and they do talk about this mitochondrial issue, but this is another thing that's like, well, how do you know it's beneficial for the mitochondria? Like, what is the standard test of a good mitochondria? And then this issue about like that's where the energy that drives the biological processes come from is just flat out wrong. I mean, Gilbert Ling really disproved that 20 or more years ago, and people are still stuck in that way of thinking. I'm not saying mitochondria are not important and that we don't need ATP for some reason, but that's not where the energy comes from. Now, I want to also, I'm glad you mentioned turpentine, and I agree that one thing I'll say is that the parasites or worms or the bacteria, they're not the cause of the health problem, but when they're called upon to help and ameliorate the terrain, they can take on a life of their own, especially when you're in a state where you keep doing ongoing damage and they can't resolve the problem, right? And you could do this unwittingly. But those organisms only start, multiplying and living in your body when there's a need, like when the terrain is such that they have food, and shelter for them. And then, yes, they can kind of become unwanted guests after a while, but also maybe that's purposely to let you know that you got to change something if you want this right to change. Now, turpentine is something that I have a lot of experience. It's one of the things I learned about early on in my natural healing journey. And it just, as part of a comprehensive protocol, people have amazing results. But I think that, I don't think that it's toxic to parasites like ivermectin may be. I mean, ivermectin is, toxic to all organisms. Turpentine, in very large amounts can be toxic, but it's actually quite less toxic than you might think. Like people have taken huge amounts and survived. And I'm talking, like 100 or more times what I would say is a therapeutic amount. But, and there's also, lots of data that you can find on turpentine, lots of animal data. And some things are surprising, like it even protects from lethal radiation doses, which I don't think too many people know. There's human studies on, like, it is the only substance I've known of that has improved pulmonary hypertension, which is kind of like an end stage of lung disease when people, end up on a ventilator when they have that problem or die. And it's actually improved with doing turpentine baths in some Russian studies. And I think it works by actually helping dissolve fat-soluble toxins that your body can't readily deal with, and they end up getting stored in your adipose tissue. And there are lots of studies showing a variety of these compounds like PFOAS, even DDT, and DDE, like even though those things have been off the market for decades, they're still in people's bodies. They pass from generation to generation. And when you use a solvent like turpentine and have lipolysis, right? So you have to be in a fat melting metabolism to benefit, but there's data that shows you can actually dump these things out, and then once your body dumps them, then those bacteria, those parasites no longer are necessary, and they just kind of calmly leave your body. Like there's no major die-off reactions like you can see in sometimes like cases of severe river blindness when they're given ivermectin and things like that. And as of recently, I'm actually offering my Power of Pine protocol free for anyone on my website. If you want to learn about this, it used to be that you'd have to do a consultation to get access, but this tells you how to take advantage of that amazing healing power of turpentine in a safe and effective way, because you can't, anyone you hear about how awesome this is, don't go out and buy some turpentine and just start taking it. You need to know what you're doing. So if you go to my website at andrewkaufmanmd.com, there's a banner right at the top. You can get your free copy of this, and it's an extremely powerful way of healing, and it really almost applies across the board to anyone that's struggling with almost any health problem. And that's just the experience that I've had, that it must be that these fat soluble toxins, if my hypothesis is correct, are really heavily involved in many illnesses like autoimmune disease, heart disease, metabolic disease, cancer, the list goes on. So it's, there are nature, and turpentine is not a pharmaceutical. It is basically the oleoresin of a pine tree, right, that's just been distilled. So, it's a natural thing, and people have been using it for, at least centuries as
hillbilly medicine.
And do you have a good source of it on your website? Do you sell that?
No, I don't. I don't sell it. There are some like regulatory issues, but there's, I always point people to Diamond G and Creekwood Naturals as two very reliable brands. Yeah. It has to be pure gum spirits of turpentine, which means they didn't add any other chemicals to it. And you can find those brands, on Etsy, Amazon, and other retail outlets.
Well, I had excellent results with it in my practice, and that sounds like perhaps a lot of the reasons why I used it maybe were not necessarily the only reasons why it was helping people. So I'm looking forward to reading what you have on your website there. Thanks for that. And I know we're coming up on time here, and we can't delve into it now, but I'd love to have a discussion with you sometime about where energy really comes from in the body. And, I've been really investigating a lot into photolysis and, process with melanin and sunlight and so forth. And how we actually have a better system than plants in their photosynthesis process because, the water molecules are going both directions in our system, where in plants it only goes in one direction. So I think we have the the ultimate energy production system in our body. So maybe we have to save that for another time.
Well, I mean, if you want the hint, I mean, I think where we're in line that it actually comes from the sun
Yeah.
and through the water.
Yeah,
And it is
exactly.
abundant and ubiquitous.
Yeah. And the melanin seems to help disassociate as well as put the water back together and release energy in both directions. So I've been really interested in that lately.
Yeah, me too.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's all
Yeah.
connected. Those four elements. It's really basic. In the end.
So, Andy, this has been an amazing discussion, and thanks again. So, what other things can you point our audience to as far as what you're up to? I know you're always doing good workshops and other things. So, if you could just give us all that information to complete.
Yeah, well, I'm actually giving my Way of Water workshop an updated version of it next Wednesday. So tickets are available for that. And it's one of my, four kind of core workshops, which I'm going to be now giving on a rolling basis. So that is, the Way of Water, Love Your Liver, Power of Pine, which goes into details about turpentine, and then Heavy Metal, which talks about specific issues with heavy metal toxicity and how you can use natural methods to ameliorate that. And I encourage everyone to sign up on my website and give your email address because I've got a lot of things going on all the time. Last week I did a free kind of pop-up webinar on the Real ID. I've been talking a lot about the coming surveillance state because we have now the administration is actually enacting a lot of policy to bring that on. So I'm trying to help people.
Emperor Palantir.
Yeah, among others,
Well, new
it's
censorship laws about anyone that wants to go anti-war rhetoric, they're really looking out for us now.
Yeah, absolutely. Censorship and surveillance are big issues. I mean, I still, even though I'm actually purposely following YouTube's guidelines, they still censor my videos, and then they restore them after I challenge it. But essentially, then it becomes a video that's just buried in the background, right? Because all the momentum when I release it is gone when they take it down. And then, 3-4 days later, they put it back up and it's not, having the same impact. So, this is definitely a challenge to get this information, out there to the public, but I'm trying to put it out as many places as possible.
Well, we've made some pretty big steps to make Chordal more accessible. The new Chordal Hub interface is quite easy to use, and I do see the need for it more and more again. I'm going to start really talking about Chordal again because in just like the way cycles work and everything, it seems like we're going back into a ramped up cycle of sort of going back 4 or 5 years ago
You
during
mean we aren't
2020.
entering into a golden age?
Well, sure, a golden age of independence through Chordal, but no, just a more censorship prone time again, it seems. And I think actually they were testing it out with the university students that were daring to call out Israel's actions, and it was very easy to fall in the trap of seeing them as quote unquote woke libtard whatever, or the people being thrown back to El Salvador and thrown in prison. And it's just this dialectic, right? That they're always foisting upon the populace to choose your team. And meanwhile, I think it's just they're all just testing what they can get away with and then how these systems can work. And then meanwhile, the march towards tyranny continues through government. And I was thinking we might touch a bit about that today, but I like that we stuck to the health side because it's so important. But definitely, Andy, it would be good to have you back on in a few months. Maybe we can dive a little more into stuff like Real ID and all the work you've been doing on the law side, because that's extremely important for people to see more that they have the power. That really, I just did a Substack last night on my drive back from Southern Oregon. And I talked about, if you want peace in the world, as we're seeing, bombs being dropped in Iran, the first step is to have peace in your own home and in your own backyard.
How
And
about peace in your own biology instead of making war on your own body?
boom, you were talking about compartmentalization in the beginning, Andy, right? How
Yeah.
everyone's specialized. Well, what do you know? Isn't that how the military industrial complex works? It's this war mechanism that's continually being used and implemented in all facets of the public sphere. And we're moving towards peace by waking the hell up and implementing all this stuff in our own lives. And I thank you, Andy, for being a strong advocate for all of this stuff with all your work. And let's knock on wood that, well, don't need to knock on wood, but you know what I mean, that our YouTube video here will stay up. If not, you can watch this on Rumble, Odyssey. We are still on Facebook, believe it or not. And I am going to start loading these all up back on Chordle, because we've been having some people messaging us why we're not doing that. So we'll get going on that. And that is completely censorship proof. There is no way even the NSA could take this video down on that platform. Anything
Well,
else
Mike,
to add, Andy?
I have a feeling that this one is going to stay up, but many times when people invite me on for an interview, they already planned ahead not to air the interview on YouTube.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
that's
this
just
happened
it.
with Alex Eck did this, the Inspire channel with Jean, blanking on his last name, right? Because they know, right? I'm the one who got David Icke's channel taken
John
off
Nolan
YouTube years
it
ago.
inspired,
Yeah,
right?
Jean Nolan, right. So, I thank you guys for putting it up. I think this one will survive, but it's, we have to be careful, and it's important for people to, a bunch of folks who were kicked off YouTube during COVID, like James Corbett and Dan Dix, and Josh Sigurdson also, to name a few, they just magically got their YouTube channels back recently. Right? And it's like, oh, we made a mistake, and took away your livelihood for a few years, but you can have it back now. And I don't know, what this means, but I don't think it's a permanent thing. Like, it's not like YouTube admitting that they're, now allowing free speech or anything, And so everyone out there, like, if something or somebody is no longer on YouTube, it doesn't mean they're not still doing their work. So make sure that you don't, just think they disappeared or, decided to call it a day. Find out what happened and seek them out. And that's why, if you should do this for Alfa Vedic, and you should do it for me, is like, get your email address on the list, because, when we have videos taken down, we let everybody know. And we let them know where to find it. And, we ask them to try to send a message to, the man that this is not the way to have a better society.
Yeah, we've had a boatload of ours taken off, and they're playing other games because 1 minute our numbers are certain, and then they change, and then it goes slow, then it spurts. It's just we're getting messed with for a long time. So yeah,
We
it's
won't
just,
see new subscribers for like a month. Like, what is going on here? That's at least getting a trickle, right? It's just like they turn off they turn it off or something. It's really interesting, man. I think the marketplace does have to play in this a bit. Thanks to competitors like Rumble and Odyssey and these others that, I think that YouTube they still have to meet with the board members. They still have, some financial culpability, and I think they do play these games to tantalize the alternative media to stay on there, just enough to keep you on, to keep sort of the power in play and the rumbles in check. So, yeah, interesting times. Andy, thanks so much for joining us. And guys, go to his website, join his mailing list. It's in the show notes. So andrewkaufmanmd.com. And Andy, thanks for all that you do. It's always a pleasure hanging with you, man. And definitely would love to have you back maybe later this year to touch on some of those other subjects.
Yeah, I would definitely look forward to that. And I really enjoyed the richness of the discussion.
Thank you, my friend. And hey, everybody, thank you for joining us today. Next week, we got Moshe back on for part 2 of our discussion. That's going to be great. And then the great Tom Cowan after that. So some bangers coming up. Appreciate you guys every Thursday, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Remember to get outside, get your feet in the dirt, go plant something, go show Mother Nature some love. She'll show it back in spades. And you guys all have a great weekend. Enjoy that summer solstice. And wherever you're celebrating Juneteenth, whatever the hell it's called. Peace.